spending the time to do
Sure.
this.
I think we should consider, when we post the agenda for the next meeting, to go ahead and scan this in and put this on there.
I sent you the PDF, so.
Yep. Okay. Good. All right. Now I think we're at the final, the second round of public comment.
I'll put Dan's name down here too, just in case. I wish, I gotta get a stamp. I will try as a late hour. I have a number of comments. It's kind of, I don't get migraines, but this was painful. You know, it's the dog's breakfast, for lack of a better word. 4 of us came up here and asked what the surplus was, and in the written presentation and in the verbal presentation, the word surplus is blank was never used. That sentence was never uttered. I listened intently. It didn't come out, thankfully, Mr. Zajac, I thank you, it didn't come out until you said it was 3.2 million, and that was very much near the end of the meeting, or end of the discussion at that point. And the 3.2 million is, as you know, tied to revenues and expenses. Mrs. Michelson asked at one point if that was a surplus, and Mr. Vail replied, well, that's your perspective. I don't know in what accounting world we live where the surplus is anything other than revenues less expenses during that year. I don't know how else you would define it. It's mind-boggling to me. This report, here's the budget at a glance. It talks about revenues and expenses. And this report launches initially, you know, I always think 30 seconds in an elevator. People want to know what's going on. Do they want a detailed analysis of the general fund balance first? Or do they want a review of actuals versus budget, which appears at the end of the analysis? That's what people want. How did you perform relative to budget? What were the actuals, revenues, expenses? What's the surplus? And yet you can't get it out of here. It's just, I mean, we talk about openness and transparency. Where is it? And there's still, I appreciate there are many questions asked to Mr. Vail, but, and Mrs. Michelson was trying to reconcile some things. Accounting is about reconciliation. I don't understand how that 3.2 million doesn't reconcile with the 3.1, which is the change in all fund balances. Where does that other money go? And if something doesn't reconcile to the penny, then I wonder if it reconciles at all. So that needs to be explained, to me at least. There is a point made a couple of times by a couple of people that the actual growth in the fund balances was a negative 666,000. I'm sorry, but what are people talking about? It was 3.1 million, if that's the correct number. The difference between 3.1 million and negative 666,000 are items that are going to occur in the future, right? Less amount appropriated for 2013 and 14 capital items and pieces. We're talking about 2013. And for 2000, that's what this report is about. And for 2013, the fund balances went up by 3.1 million. If you want to start throwing in future items, then why not throw in revenues in there too? Why not go out multiple years? I mean, it's just nonsense. 3.1, however that reconciles with 3.2, is the number. Mr. Vail commented that there was a dispute over the general fund balance. I never remember a single person in the public mentioning that. We all asked what the surplus was and what all these confusing numbers were and how they reconciled. The conversation again pointed out why a general fund reconciliation is required. Mr. Vail said that any report we want would be provided. I know what he's driving at. He wants to give a brain dump, a full ledger dump of every item that goes in and out of the general fund balance, right? So every revenue item in there and every expense item, that's not what you want. You could take, in the general fund balance, for whatever month, and this year it would be the 82 million is revenues that go in, the 78.9 million, the expenses that go out. Those are just 2 line items. Nobody for this purpose needs all that detail. And then a reconciliation of all the other funds. What went in, what went out. That's not a lot of line items. It's not hard to provide. It has to be available. And if what we're saying, if that's correct, if Mr. Vail will provide any report we request and he's looking for direction, that's what I would like to see, that report. Mr. Armstrong, You mentioned this is a good dartboard. That's not a financial term I'm familiar with. I was expecting more than a dartboard for this. But you did mention that this is all respectful of the taxpayer, and this is a multi-year strategy that's working. Where is the strategy? I don't know where the strategy is. If there were a strategy, this $3.2 million surplus number would appear somewhere, right? You would have planned for it. Your budget this year was balanced. Didn't show $3.2 million. In fact, there's still nothing written that shows $3.2 million. We all had to do the math ourselves. There was nothing last year that showed $4 million. This was unplanned and therefore not part of any multi-year strategy. So I just don't understand that. You mentioned you can prove it. I'm lost as to how you can do that. There were several attempts to say, and I'll use one of the examples, that were on target with regard to real estate tax was one that was used because actually there was a difference of $121,000, negative difference. But you're missing the point. You're comparing a budget, which I would remind you is, again, not clearly defined, but despite the fact that I've asked for that multiple times, and Mr. Vail said he would define it, this budget, that number is not the same as the number here. And did he not say he would put whatever you want to define it, it's not the original budget. If you line actuals up with the original budget, taxes are up. But that's still not the point. You compare them to actuals year over year. And if you go back, I'm going from memory, actual tax revenue last year was around $64 million. This year it's 65.5. Difference about $1.5 million, 3%. Going in my head, there it is. And if you look at the trend line, there it is. You don't compare it to a budget that we all know, none of us know where it comes from. So, actuals. And maybe a couple of other, maybe I'll stop there, because I have a headache. But I could go on those points. I would also, with regard to the Roberts Road item, Mr. Vail mentioned revenues at $33,000. The real key items is are those properties being operated at a profit or loss? And maybe that's been discussed. I don't know. But you don't just discuss the revenues. You discuss the whole picture, right? So to me, this was a real disappointment, This does a disservice to taxpayers to show this information in this format. It's really a shame. Thank you.
Hi, Judy Sherry. I appreciated Mr. Zajac mentioning one of the big changes, which was in the tuition subsidy, and asking, we projected $942,000, and we actually received $2,342,000. And what I believe I heard from Mr. Vail was that a significant part of that were payments by school districts that were back payments that they owed us from the past. Am I correct? Did I hear that correctly? Did that seem, was that your interpretation? Because then I question if we knew that school districts owed us money and that, they were going to be paying us, why is it that we budgeted such a small amount? Do we permit districts to continue to owe us money year after year, or would we have anticipated that that money would be coming in, this year? So, just to follow up with your observation, because that was a significant difference between the two. So what about that question? Why did we so under budget if we knew districts owed us this money? Were we again expecting that they wouldn't pay us? Well, I don't feel it's appropriate.
Part of the conversation moving forward is
I don't feel it's appropriate for me to ask the administration. So I ask the three of you, if any of you, in thinking about this now, and hearing Mr. Vale's explanation, does it occur to you that why didn't we anticipate that then, and why didn't we budget more? So,
Well, it's interesting because it would call into question what the total arrearages are, whether those arrearages are rolling, or whether that was strictly a one-time accumulation of past. The answer is I don't know. But I think they're great questions, because they absolutely have everything to do with how you budget for that going forward. So good question. Don't know the answer.
okay, and related to the Roberts Road, and I'm not sure I heard real clearly the different points as to why we've decided that we are going to just continue to hold these properties. But I agreed with Mr. Heldring's analysis, because I heard that, yes, they generate a $30,000 amount, but I didn't hear, and I haven't really heard, projections regarding the cost of owning these two homes. And do we need a new roof? What are our anticipated expenses going down the line? I think that's really an important detail. And I'm wondering if the appraisals could be, would the public have access to those appraisals?
I would expect probably not, because those were done at our request, and we decided as a committee a month or two ago that we would receive those appraisals and not discuss them publicly. Let's keep in mind there could be a very different board in 2 months, and that board may decide to sell the properties, and then we've divulged what the appraisals were. So this board made a conscious decision not to share the appraisals publicly.
But didn't I hear an amount that was mentioned?
You heard an aggregate amount of both properties.
Which was, what was that amount?
Not more than.
I think the specific information was that the appraisal amounts were less than what was paid for them in 2002.
So our assumption then is that on these two properties that are each on acre lots, I think, that they're going to come in less than $675,000, because that's what was said in the meeting. But, again, I'd remind the board that school boards are not their role is to educate students. It is not real estate investment. So the fact that we continue to hold these two private homes with no intention of using them for any school-related purposes, and it sounded to me like the justification for keeping them was this $30,000 of income that they're generating.
I don't think that would be,
That's not fair?
I don't think that may have been a piece of the information, but I wouldn't say that was a substantial data point. It was a data point, and the board discussed a number of different data points and made the decision that at this particular time, the board is not going to sell the properties.
Because they couldn't recoup what they originally paid for them, because they did generate income, and
The meeting occurred in executive session, and the board determined, based on all available information, that it would not be selling the properties at this time.
Yeah, I hear you. I was just listening to what Mr. Vale said in public, and that's what I was trying to review in my mind. What were his points? Because he was reviewing them in public, and I guess what I'm saying is, yes, I mean, there was information that was shared publicly, but I would be cautious not to infer that those were the only reasons or the major reasons why the board decided not to sell the properties. So there may be other reasons that just aren't being discussed in public. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying the board made a conscious decision to have this discussion in executive session and made that decision.
All right, well, as I'll listen, I guess I have to listen to the meeting again to get the other reasons that I heard mentioned, but
I mean, if it's down to the bullet points here, I think what Mr. Vale said, the value of the land of future development plans may far outweigh capital gains from selling the properties made today. That was the first. The second is the expectation is we would incur a net loss. And the third was current zoning could make the property less appealing to prospective buyers than it even seems based on the intrinsic value there.
Because the zoning changed after we purchased the properties.
Is institutional, yeah. Those were the 3 points he made.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Hi, Cindy Spurtle from Wayne. I have a couple things, I think, to be able to understand the figures. On the second page, under future, the fund balance recap, future capital needs, we're talking different figures. Future capital needs, line 44, shows to be, and Mr. Vail made the comment that the total is unknown, which it says future, that I understand, but also that he knew that it would be more than this, and the one question was, how do you know that it will be more? The second question is, down below on line 59, which the same figure, assigned for future capital needs, and then on the, I apologize, that's the first page. On the second page, we show an amount appropriated for 13-14 capital items to be $2,779,000. What's the difference between the 2 million, just for future capital needs versus capital items? I believe the future capital needs figure of 3.135 and the capital items, of which we have a copy showing the future needs of $2,779,000.
Yeah, as Mr. Zajac already pointed out, we've got a proliferation of capital accounts, some in the general fund and then some
Okay.
Specified outside of the general fund. And so what you're referring to, the $2,779,000 currently is resident in the capital reserve fund, which is outside the general fund, and that's part of that $3.762 million number that shows up on line 10 of page 2.
Okay.
The future capital needs here on page 1 are the suggested allocation of this $4.7 million that
Is the
you know
is the $1.5 million that the 1.5 million we're trying to find?
Exactly.
Okay.
So ultimately they feed into largely the same place, but at this stage they're broken out into several different.
And that's the confusion. Okay.
It's definitely confusing.
The other question I just happened to notice, because the numbers are so similar, that there might have been a typo on the second page budget to actual recap, 2012 to 2013. On line 44, and I don't know why they'd be the same, but it shows $80,102,324. On line 57, it shows $80,120,324. Transposition, but, so I said, is it a transposition, which one is correct? So I went into total, those figures, and they don't, they don't total. And I guess it's because the total that shows of 80 million is less a balance brought forward. What is, in other words, there's a $17 million difference in the figures we're provided with for expenditures, and there's a almost $11 million difference in the numbers we were provided with, is what is shown as total and what the actual total is. So what is the less balance brought forward? What does that mean? Which I can't ask.
Actually, that was a question that I had kind of lingering out there and I didn't ask.
And I know it's late, but it was confusing, and I thought it was a transposition, and then I found out that the budget and actual don't total to the total line. And we're millions and millions of dollars away, so that must be the less balance brought forward. What does that mean?
Is there a quick answer to that?
It's the $2.999 million that was appropriated for fund balance in the 12-13 budget. That was taken out for comparison purposes.
Then why are we're missing $17 million, and have an explanation in that bottom total line. If I added I
would
re-added
say
it
I would
twice.
say it's 17,000, but
Oh, 17,000?
yes.
May I answer the question, just because it's not controversial, but I know what the answer is?
It's 63, isn't it 17 million or is it 17,000? 1,000? I had too many zeros.
It gets you through this.
Why did I come up with this figure?
The question that she's asking is if you add up all these numbers in the expenditures column under budget.
Correct.
It doesn't add to the 80 million. And if you look at my proposed Exhibit B and what I handed out, you'll see a revised
It is 17
analysis where I include a catch-all line at the bottom of both revenues and expenses that accounts for all the other things that aren't highlighted here. Mr. Vale's only included certain
Okay,
line items.
That's all I wanted.
So
Thank
that-
you.
that-
That's an
that's
easy
what I-
answer. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I did.
Dan Webster, Ravenscliff Road. I have just a few comments, because most of them were already made, fortunately. I do hope that you'll take a look at what I put together here, and it would have been great if I had suggested that you look at that as we're going through this, but I didn't at the time. I want to make a couple comments on what I heard. On page 2, which I seem to have left back at my desk. Here you go. On page 2, in those lines at the beginning, or the middle of the page, Mr. Vale had said that the $3.1 million, which represents the net growth in the fund balances from year-end 12 to 13, was already allocated to be spent on $2.8 million for the 13-14 capital and about $1 million for the Peasers. But that's comparing apples to oranges, because both of those amounts were already in the year-end 2012 balance. So what he was saying is the $3.1 million increase in the fund balance this past year is going to be spent on those two items. I have no doubt that it's going to be spent eventually on something, but it's not those two items, because the $2.779 million was specifically assigned from the surplus the prior year, and that resides in one of these assigned capital fund accounts. And the $988,870 for the Peasers was accumulated prior to that year-end 2012. So I just wanted to clarify that, which is maybe presumptuous, but it is accurate. On Exhibit B, of which I provided to you, which is my recasting of this budget to actual, and actually showing the surplus deficit at the bottom, I wanted to note two things. I've added a subtotal line for benefits, and what this does here is it shows that the total benefit, the variance in the benefits accounted for $1.5 million of positive variance under expenditures. And then all those other items account for probably another $1.5 million. What's not shown and what I've added here, Mr. Armstrong, this is Exhibit B of my handout. Oh, okay, sorry. I should have used numbers. There were enough numbers. What I've done here is, as I just said during Mrs. Spurtle's comments, I've included a line that just is a catch-all for all the other changes that aren't specifically broken out here. And this was interesting, particularly on the expenditure side, because it showed that all the other expenditures that aren't broken out here were over budget by $1.6 million. So to have a net positive variance of $1.2 million, but other things were over by $1.6 million, that means the benefits were $1.5 and these other items were, probably about another $1.5 million. So I just thought it was important in this kind of presentation to show that there are cumulative variances that work the other way here, so they were negative. And given the discussion we had about this tuition reimbursement, I started thinking, well, because this is now being accounted differently, maybe part of that $1.6 million is a large offset of the revenue variance, because he instead of having this as a contra expense. Now he's broken out revenues and increased expenses accordingly. That's the kind of thing that you might be able to see if you had a little bit more detail on this. And I'm not saying list every line. That will hopefully eventually come. But for a presentation like this, there could be some big numbers that factor into that 1.6 million. And then lastly is on my Exhibit C. This is my attempt to figure out how these fund balances, why they're changing over time. And of the hours and hours and hours I spent on this, I probably spent the most hours on this one exhibit. And what I'm trying to do here is just show, if you start with Mr. Vail's beginning balances and ending balances, which are fairly clearly shown on this two-pager, I'm trying to figure out what happened in between that beginning and ending balance. And I think I've identified most of it, but you'll see in a red box on the undesignated fund balance line, which is right about in the middle of the page, that $1,553,321. And it's pretty clear to me that that just doesn't fit anywhere. So I'm very anxious to hear what the reason for that is. I am kind of surprised that we need to get the auditors involved to figure that out. That seems like such a large number that it couldn't just be a rounding error somewhere. And if I've gotten the rest of this right, which I think I have because I get to the correct ending balances, there's just that much, $1.5 million in the undesignated balance that is just, there's no rationale for it. So I hope that you will keep asking until we figure that out, because I will. I wanted to make one other comment unrelated to all that on the minutes. I didn't take up my initial public comment for this, but there was a discussion, because this plays into what we're going to talk about next month. There was in the minutes, which I didn't bring a copy of, the draft minutes, some sort of comment that you had all had agreed on the new monthly reporting format. And my recollection of the meeting was that you weren't going to agree on that quite yet until we kind of had the discussion that I was going to be bringing to you, which is the subject of the memo that I sent you earlier. So I don't know that that really matters, but it kind of, to me, it's sort of set in stone, the fact that we're going to stick with the existing reporting format for 6 months. And I just wonder what is the purpose then of what we're going to talk about next month, which is the possible refinement of that format.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. It says, Mr. Vail indicated that this evening's agenda provides samples of the suggested revised reports and recommended that they be implemented and used for a 6-month trial basis. So I think we created some lack of clarity because it's talking about plural examples, and if it's plural examples, how can we implement that for a 6-month trial basis? So
well, that's probably not what I was referring to.
oh, that's how I read it.
But it does say that you all voted to implement it, and I just, that hadn't been my recollection. I didn't think that there actually was a formal implementation. It doesn't really matter if the Finance Committee decides that anything that I've presented here makes sense. I suppose that there's no reason you can't go back to the administration and say, well, can we start using this sooner than 6 months from now? But that was really my point.
Fair enough. And just for the record and for Mrs. Norton's benefit, the minutes for last month's meeting, I believe we've agreed to change point number 3 of the summary of Ms. Sherry's comments to say, again suggested that the public be informed to understand the impact of the Health Care Act on RTSD staffing. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. This meeting is adjourned.